Hey, Brian, Thomas here. Today we're going to be going over some more with the blade tensioning gauges. I say gauges with an S, plural, because I have some awesome buddies who are also big into this whole nerding out on sawmills and trying to figure out what certain things mean and everything. But my buddy Gary Atkinson, as well as Craig Quilter, they want to do a kind of collaborative video on this, and we've got a lot of interesting stuff we want to show. But in order to show this, we have to show if there are any differences between our gauges. So on the left here, I've got my Lennox tension meter, and on the right here, we have Gary's Wood-Mizer gauge, which is actually a steric gauge. So again, these are quite spendy. And I learned about a third type of gauge just today that Simmons has, and we're going to look into something on that maybe. It's a magnetic digital gauge, but first things first, that might be a later video. It might not even be a video, not sure. But first we want to talk about these two gauges here and the difference between the two. So they're both quite spendy. Again, I bought this one off of Zorro.com for like $360-ish, and I did have a coupon that Gary gave me as well. He bought this gauge here from Wood-Mizer, but it's a steric gauge. And there are some differences between these two gauges. There's also some similarities. So let's go ahead and get these out very gently, one-handed. I'll put them side by side and everything and kind of talk about them and some of the differences therein. All right, let's go ahead and put it back this way. Okay, first things first, the Wood-Mizer gauge here is quite a bit heavier. The body here is probably steel, and I do see like oil and stuff on there, whereas this one right here, it feels like it's aluminum. I am not certain on that, but I mean, even looking at the hole in there, I've got a feeling that this is probably aluminum. If anything, it could be cast magnesium, but most likely it's just cast aluminum. This right here, again, is steel. The mechanism to tighten down, similar, but these ones right here on the actual knobs that come down, they are blunt tipped, if you can see that. On the Lennox gauge, they are not as blunt as you can see. They're more of like a, pointed. They are blunt, but not to the extent that it is on the Wood-Mizer one. They are pointed. Okay, next we're talking about the gauges here. The dial indicator, as you see on the Wood-Mizer, is quite a bit larger than that of on the Lennox, but they both kind of tell you the same thing. The increments are actually more precise on the Lennox, because it's going up in 2,500 psi increments, where on this one they're going up in 5,000 psi increments. We're looking at that inner number there. So you've got 5,000, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000. On here you have 2,500, 5,000, 3,500, 10,000, 12.5 thousand, 15,000. So I think you get a little more precision out of the Lennox one. And one of the things I've also seen, well, actually I just showed this in a video. As you can see, this face here, the entire face, Wood-Mizer and everything spins, needle stays still. On this one, again, the needle does stay still on the Lennox as well, but you're really just moving the outer rim, that ring around it, so that Lennox is always in the, normal reading direction. On the Wood-Mizer one, you can have this thing kind of all over the place. And I guess that can be confusing, but not really. One of the things I was looking at this, we're talking about preloading the gauge prior to. Can you measure from a blade that is tensioned up to a blade that goes slack? And actually you can, and I didn't think you could at first, but yes, you can. If you preload either one of these gauges, so as you can see, there's multiple revolutions that this dial indicator will go. If you preload that up, say, just like, you know, 1 revolution or so, and you set that as your 0 on the actual machine, when you detension the blade, it's going to go back. And since the increments are the same amount, you know, one would say, okay, you can do some math and you can figure out what you're looking at. Same thing on the Wood-Mizer. If you preload this gauge, which has a large swing, as you see, or large, you know, travel area, if you preload this gauge, set it to 0, you can measure both directions. And that's probably going to be a little more accurate to measure that direction. I don't know. I'm debating. And the reason I say that is if you just put these gauges directly on a sawmill that has not been run, you know, the blade's just been tensioned up, there's some differences there. Because as those wheels turn, if you go look at your gauge there's gonna be some differences. But if you put this on a blade that's been run for a little bit, I think you're getting a little more accurate reading. But also, we're gonna do a test with the Linux one, a test with the Wood-Mizer one, and then we're gonna do a test where they're both together. If they're both on the blade at the same time, will the blade stretch the same? And it should. It should. So we're going to try it. All right, let's get to work. Okay, folks, first things first, we're going to put the Linux gauge on here. Now, I've done this a few ways where I've had this gauge completely up against the blade, or I've given myself a little room. I'm not getting any difference in readings. So I'm going to go ahead, just for simplicity's sake, put that completely up where the back of the blade bottoms out on the actual device. I'm going to go ahead and tighten down the immovable side right here on the left. Give her a nice snug and everything. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to preload. I want to preload this side right here some amount. So I've got at least 4 or 5 revolutions to work with. Let's do at least 1 revolution. Tighten it down. I want to see if this gives me a more accurate reading. I know my hand's in the way and you probably couldn't see that. Anyways, I've got 1 revolution of preload on there. Now, I'm going to go ahead and zero out my gauge. Again, I know my arm's in the way and I do apologize. It's hard to see with the camera right in the way, but that looks to be about 0. Now, when I let go of the blade, it does add some tension to it just because I guess there's some movement there. Let's zero it from this location. Not much, but just a little bit. All right, now we're gonna go ahead and tighten up to 1100 PSI on the gauge on my sawmill. See what that correlates to. .500. That's 1000 PSI. And that's about 1100 PSI right there. Okay, that's reading about 17.5. It's a little more than what I've seen in the past, and I did preload the device, so I'm wondering if that has something to do with it. Now let's go ahead and detension that blade and see if it goes back to 0. And we're back at 0. And the blade is reading, it's about 0 right there. That's pretty close. All right. Now, let's do that one more time to make sure it wasn't a fluke. There's 500. There's 1000. And there's 1100 right there. And it's reading about the same, just over 17.5. So 17,000. Actually, it's probably closer to the 18,000 PSI range. Okay, I can work with that. Now let's swap out to the Wood-Mizer. Okay, we've got the Wood-Mizer gauge. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to preload it some and everything. First things first, put the gauge on there. Going to bottom it out against the back of this. Now this is a much heavier gauge. Snug that down. I'm going to preload this side. And that's a couple revolutions there. But we've got a few more revolutions, I believe, on the Wood-Mizer gauge to work with. Now we're going to go ahead and zero her out. And that's about zeroed right there. And same process. Let's work it up to 500 or up to 1100 psi. Okay, there's 500 psi. There's 1000 psi. And there's been 1100 right there. And we are reading about the same. It's slightly over 15,000. Looks to be about 17,000 or so. So that's comparable. Now let's go ahead and detension the blade. I think the presetting really plays into this. I think that's a good step. Just going to back this down. Back to 0. And the gauge is reading essentially 0 there. So that's good. We'll do it one more time, see if we get the same reading. .500 psi, 1000, and 1100. And yep, we're reading about the same again, roughly about 17,000-ish psi, maybe 16 something, but it's close. We're within, say, 100 psi of what we received the first time, so that's good. Now, let's see if we can add both of them on there at the same time and see if they both read the same reading. Okay, so we have both gauges on there. They've both been preset. There's a lot of weight on that blade, and let's see what it does. .500 psi. 1000 psi. 1100 psi right there. So 17.5 and about, I'd say probably 16 or so on the Wood-Mizer gauge. Folks, I think that right there concludes that they're both reading about the same. I'm happy with that. That's good news. That means that if you have one gauge, depending on whatever brand it is, if it's the Linux or the Wood-Mizer or any others that are like this, you can assume that they're probably operating about the same. And I think presetting of the gauge is key. I had not done that in the past, and I was getting kind of erratic readings, but by presetting that, it really actually gives me more accurate readings. Very happy with that. Let's detension this and go over a few little other items that we're going to talk about and what we plan to do in the future with these gauges and how we can help you, the viewer of this video, make sure that you're running the appropriate pressure on your blade. So it's detension, back to 0. Now again, when the gauges are on there, there is some bend to the blade, if you will, and it's hard to see. Now this gauge right here is not going back to exactly 0. It's close, but it does move around a little bit. But still, I have confidence in the way these gauges are working. Okay, folks, so we've done the testing to verify that both of these devices are running essentially the same. I mean, there's some slight variations, but that can be on setup. There's a lot of different variations that go into that, but I feel confident that this Steric gauge, which Wood-Mizer puts out and everything, is comparable to this Linux gauge here. Now, I'm going to send this gauge back to my buddy Gary Atkinson, and then my buddy Craig, who already has the same gauge here. I can assume that we have the same type of measuring devices and everything, and we can start to create an Excel spreadsheet of different pressures and what that equates to operating tension on the band of the sawmill itself. The sweet spot for cutting wood with a 1.25" blade, 42 thousandths, is between 15,000 and 20,000 psi. Now that's just doing some research online. That's kind of like where I'm trying to stay within. So with these tools here, I'm going to go ahead and test from 1100 psi up and see what range does that mean on your gauge. And we're going to do that for, of course, a Timber King 2020 mill. We're also going to go to my buddy's mill up the road who's got a 1600 mill who doesn't have a gauge. In fact, he's just got the red line that's on the side and everything. And we're going to see plus or minus off that red line, or what is that red line reading, and kind of create a chart for that. And the end goal is, I see this a lot in videos, hey, if they get waves in their wood, is tension an issue that's causing the waves? And what I have found is a lot of times tension's not so much the issue. The issue is a dull blade, a mill that's not aligned, or a set in the blade is not there. Tension, if you're operating at what the manufacturer states, you really should not have a lot of issues with wave in your wood unless you're cutting really, really fast. Speed of the cut does play into that as well, but that produces kind of a different type of wave or chatter and stuff in the cutting of wood. But long story short, we're going to look at Wood-Mizer LT40 and LT50, Timber King 2020, Timber King 1600, Timber King 1220. We're going to look at some Cook's mills. We're going to look at a lot of different stuff. And the goal is to create a chart that we can have. I need to get my website cleaned up. I'm going to have this chart on my website, and I'll have it in some videos and everything. It's a chart you can reference to. And we're going to look at different types of blades too, because I'm going to be testing 41,000s, 42,000s, 50,000s, 55,000s. And we might even test different blade widths. But for me, I'm going to run an 1.25" blade. I really don't have the need to go anything wider than that. But we're going to try to create something that can help you to become a better sawyer, or at least to become more knowledgeable in the sawing world. And yeah, you can nerd out with me and my buddies and everything as we create this chart. So hopefully this will be helpful for some folks. I know it's kind of a slow video and everything, but there's a lot of misunderstanding out there. I'm learning as I do this as well, because I've only had my gauge for about a month now, and I've been pretty impressed with what I'm seeing, and it's opened up my I guess my mind to thinking differently on blade tension. All right, folks, please like, subscribe. We will see you around. Lots of interesting videos like this are coming out throughout the year, and looking forward to getting down to Tennessee here soon too for some deer hunting, but we'll talk about that in another video. Thanks, see you around.